Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Kerbal Space Agency. In this episode, we'll be featuring the V2 rocket, the V220 mission, and the Explorer 1 mission. So let's start by actually configuring this campaign. We're going to disable missing crew respawn because of the mission where astronauts unfortunately died and we wouldn't like them to spawn back. And we're also going to disable no entry purchase required on research because we're using the historic mission contract pack, so we're actually making a bit more cash for every mission we take. So let's start by selecting some contracts. We obviously select first the altitude record of 18 kilometers, and then we select the V2 contract because we're using the V2 rocket by making the suborbital trajectory. Originally I thought I could select the escape the atmosphere contract. I thought the limit was 3 and not 2, but I couldn't, so I decided to do a different mission with the V2 rocket that was about to launch. So let's get into the VAB to start this mission. To be honest, I think there wasn't too much to see of this rocket into the VAB, so I jumped straight into the launch. So this is the V2 rocket. Let's get straight into the launch countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, lift off. So even though the V2 rocket was the first rocket to cross the boundary of space, because of the contracts we are not actually going to go to space this time. The only goal is to pass the 18,000 kilometers meter. So how are we going to do this? Well, we start angling from very early into the mission, which is what we do now, and we try to collect the early atmosphere science. So while this rocket has finished suborbital trajectory, let's talk about the V2 rocket itself. The V2 rocket was actually a rocket built by the Nazis during the World War II. It was a retribution weapon, also called the Vengeance 2, that's what the V2 stands for, made by Werner von Braun, who actually designed the Saturn rocket that brought later the Americans to the moon. So by the end of the war, the Americans and the Soviets were in a race to capture the German scientists behind this project. Americans used a project called Project Paperclip, by which they brought Werner von Braun and his brother to the United States to avoid the Soviets. And so Werner von Braun was actually brought to NASA to design the rockets. This is an oversimplification, of course, because the Americans took quite a long time to trust Werner von Braun and his team to build the rocket. One significant example is actually the Sputnik 1 of the Russians. The Russians were only the first to launch Sputnik 1 into orbit because the Americans kept on resisting the Vanguard engine, which kept on failing all the time, instead of using Werner von Braun's steam engine, which was ready quite a long time. Back to our mission now. Now that the engine has burned out, it's time to fast forward to a wrap up of 42,000 meters. This is of course quite low for the V2 rocket that was even able to get into the boundary of space, but in this mission, if we crossed the boundary of space, we would have done the following contracts as well, so we would have failed them as well. So after we have collected and transmitted the data back to the ground, all that's left to rocket is actually to splash down and crash, as there are no parachutes or rudder brakes to slow down the descent of the rocket to the ground. As a result, I will fast forward the descent to the ground 4 times, as it's quite an uneventful descent. An interesting fact is that if this rocket had a warhead and an igniter, it would pretty much be a weapon V2 rocket like the one that bombarded London during the World War II. So we're going to have a splashdown pretty soon, and splashdown. So despite the crash landing, this mission has been a complete success. Let's see how we can use the science we gained from this mission in the Kerbal Space Center. So from the available technologies, I decided to go with basic rocketry instead of anything else, because our next goal is the Explorer 1 mission, the first rocket that will go into orbit. And parachutes are not that important because we do not have a manned space program that would use them in the first place. So with that being said and done, it's time to launch our first rocket that will get into space, the V220. So while recording this, unfortunately I made 2 mistakes. The first was that I forgot to work the next morning, so this will be a nighttime launch. And the other one was that I forgot to go to the mission control, so I have to describe the contracts here. The contracts are basically to launch a V220 rocket, which is the 20th captured V2 rocket by the Americans, and to escape the atmosphere. By now it's time for the liftoff. said, the V-2 was the first object to cross the boundary of space and was also the first long-range guided ballistic missile. The Americans called the version the Bumper V-2 and they've been using it as early as 1946. The V-2 rocket, however, was very unreliable in its mission. It was only 68% successful, which for NASA is unacceptably low. What was really special about the V-2, however, was that it was the first engine that managed to do the efficient fuel pumping as a rocket. Prior to the V-2, the rockets were really inefficient or couldn't do the fuel pumping necessary to consume liquid fuel. Werner von Braun changed this once and for all, however, with the start of the space industry. But it wasn't only the Americans of Werner von Braun that were using the V-2. On the other hand, the Soviets have been using the V-2 to learn more about rocket engines by capturing the bases right after the World War where the V-2 rockets were stored. And yes, indeed, by now the V-220 has a trajectory that crosses the boundary of space. It has a trajectory that crosses the Kármán line. And as you can see here, I'm really trying to find where the science instrumentation is, but I really can't because the nighttime launch also affected me looking around. However, in the background you can see the moon, which is kind of rewarding. One day we will be there with the Apollo program. Not with the V-2, of course. And now, of course, you can hear the rewarding sound of the music of space in KSP. Obviously only KSP, because in real life there's no music in space, because, well, there's nowhere to transmit the sound. Now that we've transmitted the science data of this V-220 back to the ground, it's time we wait for the re-entry of the spacecraft. And here we go, we have an atmosphere encounter again with the V-220. This will be the first vessel to encounter reentry heating, as the other heating was just due to the high velocity in the atmosphere. And as you can see, the spacecraft really heats up and even turns around to its most aerodynamic position as the atmosphere kicks up. It didn't get demolished during the re-entry, however, because the heat forces it experiences is quite minuscule relative to the heat forces that the spacecraft that returns from orbit experiences during its descent. So all you have to do now is just wait a bit for its crash landing onto the ground, which is quite phenomenal, you have to admit when you see it. Crash in a few seconds. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. And now, as we go back into the Space Center, it's time to decide what new will we research, and also to get prepared for the launch of the Explorer 1 rocket. Now I decided to go with parachutes because I really want to go with crew capsules, but also because they're needed for the next mission after the Explorer 1, which is returning a spacecraft from space. By now, it is indeed time to launch the Explorer 1, the first craft of USA and of NASA that went into orbit. In fact, the Explorer 1 is the first mission of NASA. So indeed, we accept the first artificial satellite mission, which asks also a 40 minutes orbital period, which is basically the orbit around Kerbal, and also the orbit around Kerbal contract, and by now it's actually time to go back to the Space Center and launch the Explorer 1. Because of the stability enhancement system that was necessary for the Explorer 1, the default Explorer 1 would not fit on the launch pad, so we had to upgrade it, and now it's time to get into the VAB and see the Explorer 1 itself. Here you can see the Juno 1 booster that brought the Explorer 1 into space. Explorer 1 was launched from Cape Canaveral on January 31, 1958. Liftoff will be on 3, 2, 1, and here's the liftoff of the Explorer 1. As you might have already noticed, the Juno 1 looks awfully a lot like the Mercury Redstone that brought Alan Shepard into space. That's because the Juno 1 rocket belongs in the Redstone series, just like the Mercury Redstone does. And here KSP also has one more common point with real life. Well, the Explorer 1 also had temperature sensors, just like this one does. One other characteristic which is starting already to be noticeable is that the Explorer 1 had an orbital inclination, because it was unable to rotate properly, just like this one does, which starts to shape an inclination already. The Explorer 1 also had a highly eccentric orbit. While its perigee was at 362 kilometers, its apogee was at 2,243 kilometers. This is why the Explorer 1 was the first spacecraft to discover the Van Allen radiation belt around the Earth. Explorer 1 also had a special sensor that was able to detect micrometeorite impacts around it. And the amazing thing about it was that it was returning this data back to Earth all the way until 4 months without any solar panels, and that remained in orbit all the way until 1970. By then, men have even been on the Moon, and the Explorer 1 have been still orbiting around Earth. Now we're just trying to pitch down the rocket, but just like in real life, it doesn't really want to turn. In a few seconds, the Redstone engine will flame out, and then the stages will switch. And as you can see, it is the engine of the Explorer 1 that actually brought the Explorer 1 into orbit. And now we're getting ready to perform the orbital insertion burn, that, as you can see, brought the Explorer 1 to its final eccentric orbit around the Earth. Now it's finally time to collect the deep space data from KSP. However, if that was real life, that would just be normal space, as 300,000 is the cruising altitude for space shuttles as well. And now I think it's time for me to time warp to the Apple app so I can correct the periapse to 362 kilometers as the original, and then to sign off. And as Alan Super said, light the candles up.